So when we left off in the last video, I had the carcasses and I had the fronts already routed so I could attach the face frames, and now I can go through and cut up all the material for the face frames. You can see that even though these cabinets won't be butted together in real life, they're square. Going forward, especially when you're attaching doors, or even worse, making drawers, if your fronts aren't square, it just makes the process that much harder down the line. For the fronts of these, I'm using poplar. For any sort of paint grade materials I make in the shop, I use poplar. It's very easy to source, and even though it's more expensive to buy this stuff pre-planed and jointed at Lowe's, I usually opt to do that on projects like this because planing down a large stack of material in my shop, I just don't have the tools for it to make it efficient, so it ends up actually evening out the cost of the product versus not having to spend the time to do that. So that's kind of where I opt to go when doing stuff like this. Once I have it ripped into 1-inch strips, because the customer wanted really thin rails and stiles on this, you could see I have a stop set up on the radial arm saw, and I could cut these down. This isn't the official size. The stiles, which is what I'm doing first, I'm cutting those long. I always do that, and then I could go back and trim them. It just makes the process a little bit easier than having to cut everything. And the two end stiles are going to be wider. I do that so that when I get to the space, I could scribe those stiles to the space. So you can see all I did was I put a square on there and I marked where that groove should be on the poplar, and then I could just go through and cut a couple test pieces. With those test pieces, like I said, these are going to be inset drawers, so I want there to be no overhang on the inside of the cabinet, which you can see there's not. And then once I have that dialed in, I could go through and rip that groove on all of my pre-cut pieces. So that's essentially how that's going to look. This is a very simple process. Like I said, I like this a lot more than how I used to do it, which is splines. Another way to do this process is with pocket hole screws. Those make very solid face frames. I just prefer this sort of method. So like I said, I had my stack. I always pre-cut these into smaller pieces. It makes it easier to send through the table saw, but you can really just rip these, keep these at 8-foot long sections and send them through the saw as well. So I'm just going to do that, and then you'll see these will all pop right into place, which is what makes this process so nice. So since these are 1 inch, I intentionally made them so that these cabinets don't butt together. It's the same sort of concept as the bottom. You don't want the sides touching because it's a large surface area that can be unsquare and have undulations. If they only have to meet at the edges of the face frame, it makes it much easier to line these up in the space. You can see I have to go through and remove a little bit of material on all of my horizontals in order to put these on, which was not that big of a deal. And then, like I said, they all pop into place. They fit in place nicely without any hardware. So those are all of my vertical stiles in place, and I have everything at this point clamped together. Then all I did was I went through and I measured my horizontals, and I could pop all of those into place as well. Really simple process. I enjoy things that fit together without any hardware, and putting glue on this will just make it that much stronger. So that's what all of those look like with the horizontals. Those were all about the same size, but I usually go through and measure all of them just to be on the safe side. And since I have about a 1/2 inch space in the front, on the back side of all the cabinets, I'm going to add a 1/2 inch spacer to one edge so that the back side of the cabinets will butt just like the front. You could see with that groove, there's a little bit of a gap in between, and then the cabinets only meet on those two edges, which, like I said, makes them much easier to square up in the space. So on the back side of one of them, I'll just add, I have this 1/2 inch laying around because I was using it throughout the backers for this entire project. Just put a couple brads in the space and in the space on the back, and like I said, this is essentially just a spacer or a shim, if you will. And then I could go through and I could glue all of these on. I'm just going to add glue to the inside of that groove and attach them in place, and then you could see I'm going to stick some brads in there. these pretty much hold without any clamps, but sometimes I do have to pull out the clamps in order to get this stuff in place. These went together pretty easily. You can see that why I left the stiles long, and then I could cut them later. And then I'll sink a couple brads in all of this while the glue dries, and as I go along I will also fill those holes with putty, because the putty is going to shrink as it dries. You can see I had to put some clamps on this one, and then as it shrinks you'll have to refill the holes. So putting any sort of putty on stuff like this, you have to apply in 2 or 3 coats. So I always like to do the first coat as I'm going along. So pretty simple stuff, adding these sorts of face frames. Try and remove some of the glue, add some putty, and then I can move on to the next cabinet. And then I like to also clamp these in place. If there is a little bit of undulation in that front, some little hairline cracks, it's much easier to have these glued together, squared up, than trying to shift them afterwards. And then at this point I'm going to permanently attach these. This is important when doing stuff like drawers, because believe it or not, these will shift incrementally if they're not permanently attached, and then all your drawer reveals will be off. So at this point I pretend like I'm putting this in the space. I permanently attach this with screws going in from both sides. When I remove the clamps, they stay together. So these are very wide drawers. These are essentially going to be filing cabinets, so they're going to be holding a lot of weight. So I had to buy special heavy-duty drawer slides, not only for wide drawers, but for heavy weight. I got these from AccuRide. You can kind of pause on this if you need something like this, and you could see in the photo they're using these for filing cabinets. If you don't use specialized drawers, especially for wide drawers, you'll have a lot of racking issues. That also makes these much wider than regular slides. I don't use side mount slides a lot anymore. I prefer bottom mount, but if I remember correctly, they're usually about 1/2 inch. These ones are I think a little over 1 inch. So just a heads up, if you want to use these and pre-make your openings, they are wider. So all I did was set these up in the space. You could see they have this little removable flange as well that will go on the cabinet. It makes it a little bit easier to mount everything. And I just went through and measured in a couple spots to get my width so I could start making my drawers. I was lucky, front to back it was the same width. That's why I always stress the importance of making all these things square. That's because I've made cabinet carcasses off square. You can make changes and make it work, but it's so much easier if you can just make, especially for a project like this where I'm making 8 drawers, it makes life so much easier if you can make them all the same width, same height, same depth, because your carcasses are square. So for this I'm just going to go through and rip down some materials. I have a bunch of scrap from making the bases, so I tried and use up scrap to utilize all of the pieces. And like I said, I'm going to go through and I'm cutting these down to the height, which I believe was a little over 11 inches. I'm making sure that those fit in the openings, and then I'll go through and cut all of my fronts down to width. I like to put dovetails on these, so the front piece is going to be the same width as my opening. You can see I'm testing it out in the front of the cabinet as well as the back. If your cabinets aren't square front to back, there are ways that you can change that. If they're too small, I fixed a lot of drawer boxes this way. You can add some washers underneath the hardware to make them a little bit wider. But once again, it's so much easier if everything is just square. Once I found out that width would work, and it was the same width for all of the openings, I went through and I used the stop on the radial arm saw and cut 8 fronts, and then I cut 8 sides. The sides I usually leave a little long. I can't remember if I did it for this one because I do eventually again cut those down at the end. So usually what I do is I cut the sides a little bit long just so I could cut all the dovetails, because the dovetails are only going in the front and the sides, and then I could go forward with that. So at this point I'm setting up my dovetail jig. I hadn't used this since I moved, so it was all out of whack. I went through and I made some changes. This is a very cheap jig I got at a yard sale for like $10. Once you have it dialed in, it works really well, but it could be a pain to dial it in. But with all this scrap, it's really important to go through and spend that time getting all of the settings. I accurate, and there's a guy on YouTube that will show you how to do all that if you have one of these cheaper jigs. And then I could go through and cut this. Now these are really wide, so what I did was I took out the hardware on one side of the jig. You can see there's no hardware on this one side. It goes up right up against the spring, and I took it out on the other side as well. And that is how I was able to get these to fit in this. If I had kept those little flanges in, it wouldn't have fit. I did a test cut, and these turned out pretty much perfect. I was really happy with how these turned out. Sometimes you have a little extra material on the top or the bottom, but these were pretty perfect. And then it was just a matter of going through and cutting all these dovetails on the front and the side. Like I said, this jig can be a little bit temperamental. You can see I go through and make a lot of changes to order to make it work. Longer pieces coming out the back, I usually have to shim up so that that piece doesn't bow. But once you get it accurate, like I said, it's a very simple process, and these are extremely strong doors. Having dovetails in the front, all of the pulling force is going to be applied to that front joint. The back joint's not as important, and especially since they're very wide and going to be loaded with a lot of weight, this is my preferred method to do this. I have fixed a lot of drawers for people that have furniture that has pocket hole screws or butt joints in the front. Especially with heavy weighted cabinets, it's almost a guarantee they will eventually fail. And then you can see it's just a matter of flipping out the pieces. The sides you completely replace. The front I just flip around, and then once I do this process, I'll have the fronts for two. So I like to go across the front real quick and make a shallow cut so I don't have a bunch of tear out on this plywood. This plywood veneer is really thin. I could test that these fit, and then I like to temporarily store them in the drawer cabinet. At this point, I like to make sure they fit in there as well. So you can see I have little to no gaps in this stuff. People have asked me why I don't use hardwood for this process. It's because hardwood's really expensive. On a piece of furniture like this is already going to be an expensive piece of furniture. Plywood's dimensionally stable, and once it's finished, you can't really tell it's plywood. The only thing that will stick out is that the edges of the dovetails will still be ply, but no one's ever complained about that. So like I said, I store them in the space, and that's going to be the end of this video.